I am an African.
A lot of people on the continent are very, surprised because um, I think DRC Congo is resource rich, really. Like it has like I think almost you can literally find almost every single resource there. So a lot of people are surprised at the fact that it's one of the poorest countries in the world, but yet it has such an enormous and vast amount of resources. It's kind of, points people to this thing in Africa called the, resource curse. Could you potentially like shed light on like how this resource curse came about and if it even exists, if you think there is some sort of truth to that?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it's also, I think, worth saying that the resource curse, while it's often discussed in the context of Africa, it has been applied more broadly as well. It's not something that's just seen as specific to Africa. And then, of course, as you alluded to in your question there, it's also debated to what extent it does or doesn't exist to begin with. But I think at its simplest, the resource curse, which became very popular as an idea from the 1990s and 2000s onwards, and still holds a lot of traction today, I think. But it basically, at its simplest, is the idea that countries such as the Congo, which are incredibly rich in natural resources, minerals and metals, extractive industries, see worse development outcomes, whether that's economic development, human development, than countries with lesser wealth in natural resources. So it's seen as this, I suppose, paradox, and then it becomes this idea that it's a curse to have such natural resource wealth because it appears to lead to inferior development outcomes. Now, as you say, does this problem exist? As I say, it's a debate. People have debated it. There are some people who don't see much value in this idea of a resource curse. And I think a lot of the debate is around the fact that there might well be a correlation there between many countries where you have high levels of resources and potentially lower development outcomes, however measured or understood. But then the big question is, well, what's causing those outcomes and what's driving those outcomes, and how intimately related is that to the natural resource wealth or not, right? So I think there's a big debate to be had, but it certainly tapped into, I think, the predominant idea that people have in their minds when it comes to the resource curse and Africa in particular. And it's not only about this, but I think people will often tend to think about African governments and governance and corruption. And I think it's not only about that, but I feel in terms of the popular imagination, at least, when people talk about or think about the resource curse in Africa, they will often straight away go to corruption. And this is, and the presence of natural resource wealth feeds into a mode of governance which is inclined more towards state patronage and corruption than national developmentalist goals and ambitions.
That's interesting. So would you say that, because I mean, the way the system is right now, it kind of sounds like, I guess you would say like the corruption kind of came about, like, was this corrupt system still in existence prior to colonization, or were the mines running in some sort of different way prior to that?
Yeah, so I should have said there that, I mean, I don't personally sort of put so much emphasis or focus on corruption as the issue here. I was more just explaining, I suppose, what the resource curse is and how it's explained. I mean, personally, I think there's far too much emphasis placed on African governance and corruption as the way to understand certain development outcomes or trajectories or the way things are on the continent today. I think there's an almost obsessive focus with that as sort of the prime driver of everything. I think often what that excludes or leaves out of the question is, the external context and, the global economy and the external constraints for a kind of a quite narrow focus on what's happening internally. Not to say those issues don't exist, right? Or that they're not there. I mean, you go to Congo or Nigeria, people won't take you seriously if you deny that those problems exist. But it's just the question is, how much influence do they have on these development outcomes that people are thinking of and focusing on when they're looking at the resource curse? And so in terms of the, how does that relate to the colonial experience or the historically, which I think was your question.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I think the first thing to say is, in terms of natural resource wealth, it wasn't the colonial encounter that necessarily was the beginning of the exploitation of natural resources, right? Okay. So you had a lot of mineral and metal exploitation taking place across the continent. And one of the most sort of famous examples of this that's become increasingly popularized in recent years, through Howard French, published a book, Born into Blackness. You might have come across that. And then there's also the historian Isaac Samuel, who writes a lot about this recently, or has written some about it, is this pilgrimage taken by Mansa Musa, I think I'm correct in saying, in the 1300s, a pilgrimage from West Africa through Cairo to Mecca, where he was documented to have traveled with, a huge retinue, hundreds and thousands of people and hundreds of tons of gold, and distributing this wealth as he went. And this became sort of, a very famously documented story that kind of traveled to Europe and other parts of the world. And then, in places like Congo, you have, evidence of a long history of pre-colonial copper exploitation and so on. And so it didn't begin with the colonial period, but the colonial encounter did fundamentally alter the way in which the control and ownership over the exploitation of these resources, who controlled them, who owned them, and to whose benefit were they being produced, fundamentally, all that shifted and changed through the colonial encounter. So I think it was a fundamental shift in the way in which that productive activity was taking place and who was benefiting from it.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Well,
yeah, I think Mansa Musa was also, I think some records have it that he was the richest man to have either ever lived or definitely of his time.
Yeah.
Because lying the streets with gold and going on, I think he was going to Mecca.
Yeah.
There is this big history of minerals in abundance in many African pre-colonial African civilizations.
Yeah.
Even Ghana, if you think about it, the golden ornaments, and you think about it.
Yeah.
So moving on to the next, so moving on to the next question, we just wanted to get, like, when you read books on colonialism, when they're explaining it to kids, normally they give you the 3 Gs or the 3 Cs, which is gold, glory, and God, or 3 Cs, which is civilization, commerce, and Christianity. Mm-hmm. Now, what sort of catapulted the expansion of mineral production in Africa? And could you tell us about the structure precisely? Because, people also talk about the line of rail, like, if you look at the railway maps of Southern Africa in particular, or East Africa, they normally just it's normally for extraction. Could you just give us an explanation of what brought the, external powers into Africa? What drove the economies to come into Africa? And then what did they do specifically, and how did they design this sort of mineral exploitation in Africa?
Yeah, sure. And I think I'll focus in terms of, the motivations behind it is, I feel like that's almost a whole other discussion in itself as well. And there were many and varied. But in terms of how they went about setting up the mineral extraction and what took place there, I think we can use the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, as an illustrative example. Although, of course, things took place differently in each part of the continent at the time. But what you tend to see during this colonial encounter, as the European powers moved in and began to discover increasing amounts, in many cases, of mineral wealth, is what you saw in the case of Congo, for example, was under both King Leopold and then increasingly under the Belgian Congo in the early 1900s, was a high level of investment from Belgian industrialists into the mining and transport sectors. As you say, when you look at the transport infrastructure, much of it was put in place simply to get minerals from point of extraction to export. And you see those dynamics continue to go on today in the Congo, where you have both China and the US and Europe putting in place plans to extract minerals east and west from the Congo. So there's a colonial continuity there. But so there's heavy investment in the transport and mining sectors. And there was also a concerted effort on the part of the Belgian government in the Congo to suppress alternative trading networks and alternative trading routes. So there was a real shift in the diversity and complexity of the pre-existing economy. And there was a real concerted effort to move the economy towards being a mineral exporter, and for those minerals to be exported to the colonizing powers. And so at obviously low prices, where what you saw taking place was super profits going to colonial mining companies because their production was based upon the super exploitation of African labor. It was African labor that was either forced labor or that was being paid extremely low wages. And then being exported to Europe and feeding into ongoing processes of capitalist development that was taking place in Europe, right? So I think what you did see generally was a real shift in the ways in which those colonial economies were then forcibly inserted into the global economy, represented, I think, a fundamental break from what had existed before, and a fundamental rupture with what had existed before, and the way African economies had been inserted into regional and global networks of trade prior to the colonial encounter. It really did shift in a lot of areas that had mineral and metal wealth, and went in this direction, having a much more narrow, concentrated economic structure, which was highly dependent upon export of minerals, in a way that didn't exist to that scale or that sense before. It would be how I would see it, anyway.